There are places in a neighborhood where people feel a quiet sense of ownership, even when they do not truly own anything. A shared pool, a common driveway, a small corner garden with a bench. These are the areas where most HOAs claim they hold power. But the yard behind my home was not one of those places. It wasn't shared, it wasn't disputed, and it certainly wasn't communal. It was mine. A fully fenced, clearly surveyed, legally documented piece of land that came with my home. I bought the property precisely because of that yard, a little patch of green at the edge of the neighborhood where the trees stood tall enough to block the noise of the main road. It was peaceful, it was private, and it was paid for with every dollar I had saved over years of work. For the first few months, it stayed untouched. I spent my weekends mowing, planting wildflowers, and shaping the place into something beautiful. The neighbors would slow down as they walked past, admiring the small improvements I made. A few even complimented me, saying it looked better than most of the community-maintained areas. If there were concerns, no one mentioned them. The HOA seemed indifferent, and I was happy to stay under the radar. But peace in an HOA never lasts long. It never arrives quietly, and it certainly never leaves quietly. The first hint that something was wrong came in the form of a notice taped to my front door, a cold, printed sheet with a familiar HOA letterhead. The message inside was simple but unsettling. They claimed the board had voted on a new community beautification project, and my backyard, my private yard, had been marked as the proposed extension of a walking trail that the HOA had been planning. The path, they wrote, would be a benefit to the entire neighborhood. And because my yard visually blended with a community greenbelt, they argued it was believed to be part of the association's usable space. It was a lie. A bold one. A documented one. But a lie nonetheless. My first instinct was confusion, followed by annoyance, and then a rising sense of disbelief. They had not asked me. They had not proposed anything in advance. They had simply declared my fenced backyard as theirs, as if years of property law and boundary lines meant nothing. I walked out to the yard that evening, standing in the middle of the grass, trying to imagine what they were thinking. Did they truly believe they could just take it because it looked nice? Because I kept it better than the common areas they were supposed to maintain? Or because someone in the board decided my space would be more useful than their own poorly kept lawns? A few days later, the situation escalated. Trucks arrived. Workers I had never seen before began unloading equipment near the boundary of my property. They moved confidently, as if they had every right to be there, as if the land was already theirs. They walked along the outside of my fence, inspecting the area, pointing at places where they wanted to put benches, trees, and decorative lighting. They took notes, snapped photos, and talked about timelines. The HOA president, a woman who often gave long speeches about community spirit, stood proudly overseeing the plans. No one came to speak to me. No one knocked on my door. No one asked permission because they believed they didn't need any. Over the next week, more notices piled up. They told me I would need to remove a section of my fence because it encroached on future HOA grounds. They informed me that the community walking path would begin construction within 2 weeks. They even added that I would be responsible for removing unauthorized personal items, which, according to them, included my garden bed, my wooden bench, and even my lawn decor. The absurdity of it all made it difficult to stay calm. But beneath the frustration, a different feeling started to form. It wasn't anger, it was strategy. Unlike the HOA board, I understood property law. Not deeply, but enough to know when someone was bluffing. And something about the confidence with which they moved told me this was not about legal right. It was about pressure. They counted on fear, on residents giving in, on people not wanting to deal with paperwork or conflict. They thrived on compliance. They moved like people who assumed no one would fight back. So I decided to fight, not with shouting or threats, but with silence and paperwork. I spent the next few days going through my deed, my survey documents, and my closing files. Everything was crystal clear. The land was mine. Every inch, every tree, every patch of grass. There was not a single clause that gave them any claim. But that alone wasn't enough. HOAs are stubborn, and when confronted, they don't reverse course easily. They double down. they push harder. They send more notices. And that is exactly what they did. They claimed their interpretation of the boundaries differed. They claimed the original builder made ambiguous design choices. They claimed the yard functionally served as part of the greenbelt. It was all noise. But noise can still cause damage. The real shift happened when one HOA board member slipped a comment during a community meeting, one I did not attend but heard about later. He said the board had already secured partial funding for the walking trail extension and that my yard was the only practical place for it to go. The HOA had already made promises to sponsors, and now they needed to deliver. In other words, they needed my yard to complete the deal. That was when I realized this wasn't personal. It was financial, and they were in too deep to admit they were wrong. The next week, the workers returned and began marking the edges of my fence with orange spray paint. I watched them from my kitchen window, quietly, calmly, because while they believed they were winning, I already knew what was coming. Their arrogance had created the perfect setup for something they never expected. I wasn't going to stop them. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to block the construction or threaten them with lawyers. Instead, I was going to let them dig their own hole, one deeper than any walking trail they could build. Because while they were busy claiming my yard as theirs, I had discovered a loophole so beautiful, so devastating, and so absolutely unbreakable that once it was activated, no amount of HOA power could undo it. I was going to turn my yard into something they could never seize, never touch, never control. A public park. A legally protected, city-recognized public park. And all I needed to do was let them keep building. The morning after the workers sprayed their orange lines along my fence, I walked the perimeter of the yard and studied every mark. It was almost amusing. They had acted with such confidence, drawing those bright streaks as if they were laying claim to something they already owned. It reminded me of a child declaring a sofa cushion to be their castle simply because they touched it first. But these lines, as bold as they looked, were meaningless. The only thing they did was highlight the exact area the HOA planned to transform. And, ironically, that information was precisely what I needed. When most people hear the words public park, they imagine long processes, endless approvals, and complicated legal steps. But in my city, things worked a little differently. Due to older zoning codes and a shortage of accessible green spaces, the municipality had adopted an unusual policy. Private land could be voluntarily designated as a micropark by its owner, bypassing many of the usual requirements. The land would remain privately owned, but it would gain permanent protection from seizure, alteration, or reassignment by any third party, including HOAs. It was a relic of old legislation, forgotten by most, buried deep in dusty municipal archives. But not forgotten by me. The night I discovered it, I reread the documents 3 times to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting anything. The rules were clear. The owner could apply directly. The land became protected immediately upon approval. And best of all, the city took a particular interest in small, community-friendly spaces that could be used for walking, resting, or simple enjoyment. My yard already matched everything they wanted. And with the HOA's construction plans underway, the transformation into a public green zone wasn't just possible, it was guaranteed. Still, I needed more than an idea. I needed evidence. Fortunately, the HOA was generous enough to provide it themselves. Every spray-painted line, every notice they taped to my door, every worker they sent to inspect the area, all of it documented the HOA's intention to alter the land. And that made my case even stronger. Over the next few days, I kept quiet. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't file complaints. I didn't make threats. I simply observed. The HOA took my silence as surrender. They mistook my calm for acceptance. Workers arrived more frequently now, stepping onto my property without hesitation, measuring, planning, mapping the future trail. The HOA president stood with them often, her arms crossed proudly, imagining the praise she would receive once the beautification project was complete. It was clear she was preparing to showcase this as her victory, her legacy for the neighborhood. Little did she know she was about to hand me the perfect opportunity to turn her victory into a monumental defeat. I spent the week gathering every document I needed, The deed, the survey maps, photographs of all the unauthorized activity, and copies of every notice the HOA had sent. I also took photos of the workers on my land, nothing confrontational, just quiet documentation. I knew better than to interfere. The more they did, the stronger my case became. On a Thursday morning, I made an appointment with the municipal planning office. It was a small building downtown, tucked between the courthouse and a row of aging storefronts. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and coffee, and the staff worked calmly, unaware of the battlefield I was entering. When I sat down with the planning administrator, I laid out everything. The property documents, the photos, the proposed construction plans, and the explanation of how the HOA believed they had the authority to seize the land. The administrator listened carefully. When I finished, she looked through the paperwork, flipping pages with slow deliberation. When she reached the city's micropark designation form, her eyebrows lifted slightly. She understood immediately what I was doing. She asked a few clarifying questions, reviewed the zoning map, and confirmed the land fell within the qualifying parameters. Then, with a small, almost amused smile, she approved the application. Just like that, in less than an hour, my backyard became a legally recognized micropark, protected by city ordinance, immune to HOA authority, and shielded from any forced changes. And because the HOA had already begun construction activity, the irony was perfect. They had just improved the park they would soon be legally barred from touching. I walked out of the municipal office that day feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The paperwork in my hand wasn't just legal protection. It was a shield and a sword. It ensured that the yard I had nurtured would remain untouched and safe from the hands of anyone who believed they could override ownership through arrogance alone. But I didn't reveal my victory yet. Timing was everything. Back in the neighborhood, the HOA appeared busier than ever. The president walked around with a clipboard, gesturing dramatically at various parts of the yard, telling workers where the benches would go and how the lighting should look. Residents wandered past, curious about the changes, asking questions. The board members acted as if they had orchestrated something grand. Their excitement only fueled my patience. The funniest thing about the situation was that no one, not a single worker or board member, seemed to question why I allowed them to keep working. They expected resistance, arguments, threats. They expected the usual homeowner reaction. When that reaction never came, they took it as silent permission. Their biggest miscalculation was believing that quiet meant defeat. The best victories, after all, are the ones earned without raising your voice. 2 days after my park status was approved, a city inspector arrived to take photographs and verify the land for the municipal record. He wore a bright neon vest and carried a clipboard, making him impossible to ignore. The workers immediately paused, unsure who he was or why he was there. The HOA president rushed over to intercept him. I watched from my window, the scene unfolding exactly as I imagined. She greeted him with her familiar confident posture, likely assuming he was there to assist the HOA project. But as soon as he explained his purpose, her posture changed. Her hands dropped from her hips. Her smile faltered. Her head tilted slightly, the way it does when someone hears news they didn't plan for. From a distance, I saw the inspector show her a document, the same one I held in my hand 2 days earlier. He pointed toward the yard, then toward the workers. Her body stiffened. Her face tightened. She looked toward my house, then quickly away, as if eye contact might somehow make the situation worse. It was only the beginning. That afternoon, the HOA issued a sudden stop work directive, forcing the workers to pack up and leave. The orange lines they had sprayed remained, fading slowly under the sun, mocking the confidence with which they were drawn. The president walked the edge of my fence again, this time not with pride but with a kind of stunned disbelief, as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted without warning. She still didn't know the full extent of what had happened. The real meltdown was still ahead. Because once the HOA realized the yard had become a protected public park, thanks entirely to their own actions, everything they had planned, promised, and invested in was about to collapse spectacularly. The morning after the stop work order, the neighborhood woke up to an unusual silence. For weeks, the sound of trucks, drills, and footsteps had become a constant backdrop, an unwelcome reminder of the HOA's relentless determination. Now, everything had stopped. The workers were gone. The equipment was gone. Even the HOA president, who normally strutted around the neighborhood like she owned every blade of grass, was nowhere to be seen. But I knew she wouldn't stay quiet for long. People like her never do. By noon, an emergency meeting notice appeared in every resident's email inbox. The subject line was dramatic, almost theatrical. Urgent HOA matter. Mandatory attendance. It was the kind of message meant to stir panic, make people feel the community was on the brink of collapse. But in reality, the only thing collapsing was the HOA's illusion of control. I didn't attend the meeting. I didn't need to. Word spread quickly, and within an hour, the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers. Residents stepped onto their porches, talking to each other in low tones, glancing toward my house as if expecting me to walk out with answers. They didn't know yet what had happened. They only knew the HOA's grand project, the one they had bragged about, hyped, and boasted to sponsors, had been halted abruptly. Inside the community center, the meltdown was already in full swing. The HOA president opened the meeting with a voice that strained to sound calm, but betrayed a subtle tremble. She explained that unexpected complications had arisen, requiring the temporary suspension of construction. She tried to frame it as a minor setback. But the residents weren't buying it. Too much enthusiasm had been invested in the project. Too many announcements had been made. Too many promises had been delivered with absolute confidence. So when one homeowner asked what the complication was, her facade cracked. She admitted, reluctantly and with bitterness, that the city had intervened. She said the land involved in the project was suddenly, inexplicably, recategorized by the municipality, preventing further development. She glossed over the details, conveniently omitting the part where I, the actual owner, had filed for the change. She claimed the city overstepped and that the board would fight the designation. But real cracks appeared when another homeowner asked a simple question. Isn't that land privately owned? How did this happen? At that moment, the board members exchanged looks. They realized the situation was far worse than a simple setback. They couldn't explain why they had launched a major construction project on land they didn't own. They couldn't explain why they had acted without permission. They couldn't explain why they had taken money from sponsors before verifying legal rights. The room, once full of quiet support, now simmered with suspicion. When the meeting ended, the president stepped outside the community center looking exhausted. Her confidence had faded. The HOA's certainty was crumbling. And the residents, who once trusted the board, now doubted everything it touched. That afternoon, the HOA finally reached out to me directly. A printed letter appeared in my mailbox, asking me to clarify the recent municipal designation of your yard. The wording tried to sound neutral, but the undertone was transparent. They wanted answers that could help them undo the damage. I didn't respond. Instead, I spent the next few days watching the board scramble. Their panic became obvious through their behavior. The president spent hours walking the neighborhood with different board members, pointing at my fence and gesturing wildly as she tried to convince them she had everything under control. But they weren't convinced. Her authority was slipping. Soon things escalated. The HOA sent me another notice, this one much more urgent. They demanded a meeting. They insisted the land designation must have been a misunderstanding. They asked for the documents I had submitted. They asked for cooperation. I remained silent. The beauty of this moment was that I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't even need to explain. The law spoke for me. The city ordinance spoke for me. My property deed spoke for me. The harder the HOA pushed, the more desperate they appeared. Then came the moment that truly shattered their control. A formal letter arrived not for me but for the HOA from the Municipal Planning Office. It was brief, firm, and final. It stated that the land behind my home had been designated as a protected public micropark. All development, modification, or maintenance activity required approval from the city and the property owner, me. The letter also noted that unauthorized construction had already taken place and that the HOA would need to address the violations promptly. The HOA was now facing not only embarrassment, but possible fines, legal repercussions, and the wrath of their sponsors. The president could no longer pretend this was a temporary inconvenience. It was a complete and irreversible defeat. Over the next few days, the neighborhood watched the fallout unfold. Sponsors began calling the HOA demanding updates. The companies that had contributed funds and materials for the walking path wanted to know why construction had stopped. Some wanted refunds. Others wanted penalties enforced. The HOA board scrambled to provide explanations, but couldn't give any that didn't expose their negligence. Residents, frustrated by the secrecy, demanded transparency. They wanted to know why the HOA tried to seize private land. They wanted to know why the board had rushed into a project without clear boundaries. They wanted to know why their dues had been spent without proper oversight. Rumors spread quickly, each one painting the board in an even worse light. Meanwhile, I maintained silence. I didn't boast. I didn't confront them. I didn't seek revenge beyond the quiet victory already secured. Sometimes the most satisfying form of justice is simply letting the other side unravel on its own. But silence didn't stop the HOA from digging deeper into panic. The board president, once proud and loud, began walking around the neighborhood with visibly forced smiles. She knocked on doors, trying to reassure residents that the situation would be resolved soon. But even from a distance, it was clear she no longer believed her own words. The breaking point came during a second emergency meeting where the board tried to present a solution. They suggested negotiating with the city. They suggested attempting to overturn the designation. They even suggested that perhaps the homeowner, me, was misguided and would cooperate for the good of the community. But the residents weren't buying any of it. Not this time. Too many lies had been told. Too many boundaries had been crossed. Too many decisions had been made without permission. The board had lost the trust it once relied on. And the president, who had built her reputation on controlling narratives, now faced a room full of people who no longer believed anything she said. The meltdown had officially begun. And as tensions rose inside the community, the HOA had no idea that the biggest blow, the one that would end their project permanently and expose their misconduct publicly, was still on the way. The days following the second emergency HOA meeting felt strangely peaceful. The chaos circulating around the board felt distant, almost like a storm happening on the other side of a window. I watched from the quiet sanctuary of my home while they scrambled, struggled, and sank deeper into the mess they had created. The yard, now officially a public micropark, stood untouched and serene, as though it were quietly enjoying its new status, immune to the turmoil outside its boundary. But the calm was deceptive. The situation was evolving rapidly, and the HOA's true desperation was becoming clearer with every passing hour. The board had realized the gravity of their mistake. Not only had they trespassed and initiated unauthorized construction on private land, but now, thanks to the new designation, that same land had become a protected public space. That meant every action they had taken without permission was now a violation of municipal law. The city wasn't angry yet. They were simply waiting for the HOA's compliance. But the warning signs were unmistakable. If the HOA did not address the violations soon, fines would follow. If they resisted, legal consequences could escalate. The HOA president knew this, and it terrified her. She tried everything to regain control. She attempted to rally the board members, promising that they could negotiate with the city. She insisted that the designation could be reversed. She even went door to door seeking support from residents, pleading for signatures to pressure the city into reconsidering the park's status. But the residents were tired of being misled, tired of the secrecy, tired of watching their dues funnel into poorly executed projects. Many politely turned her away. Some not so politely refused. A few shut the door in her face. The whispers throughout the neighborhood grew louder. People were beginning to suspect that the board had known the land wasn't theirs, or at least had ignored warning signs. Some wondered if money had been mishandled. Others believed the president simply wanted a legacy project, something she could proudly call her accomplishment. But no matter the theory, one thing was certain. The board's credibility was collapsing. For me, The situation was a slow-burning victory. I didn't need to intervene. I didn't need to escalate anything. The system was doing that for me. The truth had weight, and it was dragging the HOA down with every passing day. Still, there was one final move the HOA didn't anticipate, one that would seal the fate of the entire project. A week after the designation was approved, the city inspector returned, accompanied by a municipal compliance officer. They walked the perimeter of the yard, taking photos and making notes. I watched from my window, knowing exactly what they were documenting. The spray-painted marks. The ground the workers had disturbed. The areas where the HOA had begun preliminary construction. All of it was evidence that the association had acted without legal authority. Later that afternoon, the compliance officer met with the HOA president. Their conversation, though too quiet for me to hear, was easy enough to interpret from their body language. The officer's calm, professional demeanor contrasted sharply with the president's increasingly frantic gestures. She paced, pointed toward the yard, shook her head, waved her hands, clearly trying to argue, explain, blame someone else, or find a way out. The officer responded with a few measured sentences. Whatever he said brought her movements to a halt. She stood still, shoulders slumped slightly, defeated. That moment was the beginning of the end. The city issued a formal order. The HOA had to remove everything they had added, restore the land to its original condition, and file a written acknowledgement of their violation. Their walking path project was officially dead. Their beautification plan was terminated. The funds from their sponsors had to be returned. Most painful of all, the HOA was now burdened with the cost of restoring my park back to pristine condition. The irony was almost poetic. The same HOA that tried to take my yard now had to pay to fix it. News spread quickly among residents. Chairs on porches leaned forward. Conversations grew animated. People shook their heads in disbelief. Many laughed quietly at the absurdity of it all. The board had not only embarrassed themselves, they had created a crisis entirely of their own making. Meanwhile, I kept my distance. I had no interest in gloating or adding fuel to the fire. The HOA had done enough damage to itself. But even in silence, I wasn't immune to the attention. Neighbors approached me cautiously, curious but polite. Some asked how I managed to turn the situation around so effectively. Others simply said they admired my patience. A few apologized on behalf of the neighborhood, ashamed of how the HOA had acted. I responded with calm neutrality. The situation wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting what was mine. And now, thanks to the park designation, it would always remain that way. But the HOA wasn't done panicking. The board held a third emergency meeting, this time behind closed doors. No public announcements, no invitations to residents. They were hiding now, retreating into secrecy in hopes of salvaging what little authority they had left. But secrets don't stay buried for long in a neighborhood where gossip moves faster than official notices. By the next morning, the outcome of the closed-door meeting was already circulating. The HOA planned to challenge the city's decision. They wanted to hire a lawyer, file an appeal, and fight the park designation in court. It was a desperate last attempt to save themselves, an attempt fueled not by reason, but by pride. The residents, however, were not impressed. Fighting the city meant spending more of their dues. It meant more chaos, more conflict, and more mistakes. Board members began resigning. One within 24 hours. Another shortly after. The president found herself increasingly isolated, clinging to control even as her support crumbled beneath her. And yet, none of them understood the biggest revelation still waiting to unfold. Inside the municipal file, attached to the park designation, was a clause none of them had bothered to read, a clause stating that once private land becomes a public micropark, reversing the designation requires not only city approval, but also the explicit consent of the property owner. My consent. The HOA could scream, argue, appeal, and threaten. They could hire lawyers, host meetings, or create petitions. But they could not change a single blade of grass on my land without my permission. They were fighting a war they had already lost. All that remained was for the truth to reach them. And when it did, The aftermath would be even more devastating than anything they had experienced so far. The tension in the neighborhood began to thicken like humidity before a summer storm. What had started as a simple legal maneuver now grew into something larger, something louder, something the HOA had never imagined they would face, a community that refused to bow. Yet beneath that growing resistance, the HOA worked quietly, whispering in circles, scheming behind closed doors, and planning their retaliation with the same desperation as someone trying to push back a rising tide. The first sign of their war came early one morning, long before the neighborhood fully woke. A stack of new HOA notices appeared on doors throughout the subdivision, print heavy, tone aggressive, and clearly designed to spark fear. They warned homeowners that unauthorized gatherings in the park could lead to fines. They demanded compliance with property view corridor expectations that supposedly gave the HOA authority to regulate anything seen from the street. They even claimed that the park constituted a visual disruption, a phrase so vague it could have meant anything from a fallen branch to a misplaced pebble. Despite these attempts, the park only grew more alive with each passing day. What had once been a stolen yard transformed into a local haven, and families treated it exactly as that. Children played tag under the shade trees, seniors walked slow loops around the winding pathways, dog owners congregated near the benches, chatting as their pets roamed freely. And every moment the community enjoyed that space was another reminder to the HOA that they had lost control over something they believed they owned. But their anger wasn't quiet for long. Soon, inspectors hired by the HOA began walking the neighborhood with clipboards, snapping photographs of any homes they could target. Grass too long, mailbox slightly tilted, trash bins not hidden fast enough. Every small detail became ammunition in their campaign to regain dominance. Their approach was simple. If they couldn't fight the park, they'd punish the residents using it. Residents frustrated by the sudden wave of violations turned to the park's creator for answers. They gathered in small groups, sharing the letters, reading them aloud, and asking if any of it was legal. And while he explained the limits of the HOA's power, something else happened. People started questioning why they had tolerated the HOA for so long. The park had become a catalyst, a mirror showing the community what life could look like without constant threats hanging over their heads. The HOA president, however, did not view the situation with such optimism. She saw only the slipping of her authority, the unraveling of a system she believed existed to maintain order. Rumors floated around that she had begun lobbying county officials, pushing for restrictions on public land usage, and even attempting to challenge the park's protected status. Each attempt was met with bureaucratic roadblocks, and each failure intensified her determination. The conflict escalated when the HOA sent a formal notice claiming the park's entry path encroached on community-maintained land. It was a thin argument and legally baseless, but they issued it with the confidence of people who had never before been challenged. The letter accused him of altering the neighborhood's layout without approval, even though, by law, the HOA had no jurisdiction over public land. But the HOA wasn't seeking truth, they were seeking a foothold. In response, he filed yet another counterdocument, this time requesting official clarification from the county and state regarding the HOA's lack of power over protected land. The confirmation came quickly and decisively, and once it did, he pinned a copy to the park's notice board for everyone to read. It became a symbol of reassurance, a visible reminder that the HOA's grasp was weaker than their threats suggested. That visible defiance drove the HOA into a frenzy. A week later, residents awoke to find orange construction fencing surrounding parts of the park's perimeter. Signs had been hammered into the soil claiming that unsafe conditions required temporary closure. The HOA acted as if they had authority to shut down the space, despite repeated warnings that they did not. Their goal was simple: block access long enough to create frustration, weaken support, and then push through their beautification project under the guise of community safety. But the residents didn't fall for it. They tore down the fencing within an hour, dragging every stretched ribbon and metal stake into a pile at the park entrance. When the HOA demanded to know who had done it, not a single person confessed, because everyone shared the same sentiment. This was their park now, their collective place, and the HOA had no right to barricade it. The next escalation was far quieter, but far more dangerous. Late at night, after the park emptied and the streetlights buzzed softly in the dark, someone slipped onto the grounds with a bucket of herbicide. By morning, several patches of grass had browned, curling at the edges and sinking into the soil like dying skin. It wasn't the work of nature, it was deliberate destruction. Word spread quickly, and outrage followed. What had once been mere conflict shifted into something darker, something malicious. Residents who had never before cared about HOA politics now saw the organization as a threat. Parents feared letting their children play on the grass. Dog owners warned each other to watch for poison. The HOA denied involvement, but the timing, the method, and the history made it clear who was behind it. Instead of backing down, the community rallied even harder. Volunteers showed up with gardening tools, seeds, and watering cans. They replanted the patches, cared for the soil, and left hand-painted signs around the park encouraging kindness, unity, and resilience. The sabotage had backfired completely. It only strengthened the bond among the residents and deepened their distrust of the HOA. The HOA president, now cornered, began preparing something drastic. She called an emergency board meeting, shut the doors to the clubhouse, and demanded the discussion remain secret. Residents who pressed their ears against the walls heard only fragments, words like lawsuit, easement challenge, revoking rights, and forced compliance. Whatever plan they were forming, it was aggressive, risky, and aimed at taking the park back, no matter the consequences. As the meeting carried on well past sunset, the neighborhood watched the dark clubhouse windows glow with flickering light. Something was coming. Something the HOA believed would end the battle once and for all. But they were forgetting one crucial detail. The park was public. The community was united. And their opponent had beaten them at every turn with strategy, not force. They were walking into a war they were not prepared to win. And as night settled in, the first signs of the HOA's final attack began to take shape. The HOA's last stand began not with noise, but with silence, an eerie, calculated quiet that signaled they were preparing something decisive. For days, no inspectors walked the sidewalks. No violation notices appeared on doors. No meetings were called, no warnings issued, no veiled threats slipped into mailboxes. It felt too calm, the kind of calm that settles right before a storm breaks apart the sky. Residents sensed it. They whispered about it under the trees of the park, exchanged uneasy glances, and watched the HOA clubhouse with suspicion. Even the children, who had grown used to playing freely on the grassy paths and under the tall shade trees, seemed more careful, as if the shift in atmosphere had somehow reached them too. And then, on a gray Monday morning, the silence shattered. The HOA filed a lawsuit. Not a simple complaint, not a minor claim, but a full legal assault aimed at dissolving the park's protected status. They argued that the public usage designation was invalid, that the transformation from private yard to public park violated community covenants, and that the HOA's authority superseded county land use decisions. Their case was bold, reckless, and built on a foundation of assumptions rather than law. When residents learned what had happened, panic rippled through the neighborhood. Some feared losing their new sanctuary. Others worried their property values would plummet. Many were simply exhausted, overwhelmed by the endless battles. The HOA hoped that fear would break the community apart, weakening their unity long enough for the lawsuit to succeed. But what the HOA didn't realize was that this lawsuit triggered something powerful, something irreversible. The county had no intention of letting them challenge a designation they had willingly approved. And when the park's creator submitted his legal response, he included a meticulous timeline of the HOA's actions, their harassment, their sabotage attempts, their unauthorized fencing, and their repeated claims of authority over land they did not own. He included photographs, documentation, witness statements, and every county correspondence affirming the park's protected status. It was a fortress of evidence, one the HOA could not penetrate. When the court date arrived, the hearing room filled quickly. Residents sat in tight rows, arms folded, eyes locked on the HOA board members who looked far less confident than usual. The air felt tense but expectant. This had become more than a land dispute. It was the final chapter of a war for control, for peace, for the right to enjoy a space the community had come to cherish. The judge listened carefully as both sides presented their arguments. The HOA spoke with urgency, insisting the park was an unauthorized modification that threatened neighborhood cohesion. Their attorney attempted to paint the park as a reckless act, accusing its creator of intentionally undermining the rules. But the county representative's statement ended the argument almost instantly. The park, they explained, was legally recognized public land under municipal protection. The HOA had no authority, none, under any interpretation of the law, to regulate it. Furthermore, the HOA's attempts to block access, alter the grounds, or impose neighborhood rules on a public facility were considered direct violations of state statutes. Then came the evidence of sabotage: the herbicide-damaged grass, the removed fencing, the threatening notices. The judge grew visibly displeased. The HOA president's face drained of color. And as the final document was presented, a certified letter showing the park's permanent protected status, the outcome became unavoidable. The judge dismissed the HOA's lawsuit in full. But what happened next was something the HOA never expected. The judge ordered an investigation into the HOA's conduct. Residents in the courtroom gasped. The board members looked stunned. The president stumbled over her words, insisting they had only acted in the community's best interest. But the more she insisted, the worse it sounded, because now their actions had crossed lines far beyond their authority. The investigation uncovered what residents had suspected for months: misuse of HOA funds, unauthorized spending on private inspectors, attempts to influence county officials, and covert operations meant to sabotage the park's public status. The herbicide incident, while not explicitly linked to a board member, was deemed consistent with a pattern of HOA misconduct. The state issued penalties. The board was dissolved. New elections were mandated, and several members, including the president, were barred from ever serving on a homeowners association again. The HOA collapsed. When the news broke, the neighborhood exhaled collectively, relief, disbelief, and pride flowing freely through the community. Residents held an informal gathering in the park that same evening. They brought blankets, snacks, folding chairs, and even a small speaker that played soft music under the canopy of trees. As the sun dropped behind the rooftops and warm orange light washed across the grass, the park's creator walked the paths quietly, watching families enjoy the space he had fought to protect. Children chased each other near the benches. Seniors sat in small groups, discussing upcoming gardening plans. Dogs trotted happily around the open lawn. The park wasn't just land. It had become a symbol, a reminder of what a community could accomplish when people stood together against intimidation and misuse of power. By nightfall, soft lanterns placed along the edges glowed gently, lighting up the winding paths like tiny stars on the ground. Someone had hung a wooden sign on the entrance archway. Carved into it were simple words, but powerful ones. Community Park, built by the people, protected forever. The HOA had tried to seize his yard. Instead, they lost everything. The park remained. The people remained. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt peaceful, not because rules forced compliance, but because unity made harmony possible. The battle was over. And the park would stand long after the HOA's reign had faded into nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered across backyard fences and late-night porch conversations.